Awesome. Okay. So yeah, thanks Chris for the introduction and thanks everyone for tuning in. We're going to be talking about slip and slip deficit, the 2020 magnitude 7.8 Simeonof earthquake and interseismic coupling of the Aleutian Megathrust. I'd like to take a second to thank collaborators and contributors, particularly Logan Fuso and Ronnie Krepenthin from the University of Alaska Fairbanks and Zhouhui Xiao from Michigan State. And I'm Connor Drooff, and my advisor is Jeff Freimuller, and we'll be giving this talk. This picture comes from Kodiak. This is one of the first GNSS sites that was established in the island and imaged the locking of the megathrust outboard of Kodiak. So subduction coupling is commonly referred to as slip deficit, and it's a measure of the degree of coupling along subduction interface. It arises from the superposition of a locked region of the megathrust, which is depicted in this cartoon from late 2012 as a lighter gray region, which is typically in the depth region between 10 and 30 kilometers. And this usually lies up dip of, or almost always lies up dip of stable sliding and creep at depth. And it's this interplay between locking and creep, which leads to this concept of slip deficit, which can be thought of as energy that's being stored up to be released in the form of great earthquakes at some point in the future. Typically, energy is kind of concentrated, or at least seismic moment is concentrated in asperities, which are denoted by these darker gray regions here, and they vary in size and shape and their ability to rupture in large earthquakes at some point in the future. There's a variety of factors which have been linked to slip deficit variations along the length of megathrusts, particularly dip concavity thermal structure of the subduction zone. So these are large features that can be observed. The incoming sediment layer is really kind of recently been appreciated as a big contributing factor. The fluid properties and erosional characters of incoming sediments actually play a major role in determining coupling properties of a subduction megathrust, particularly regions of high fluid content typically do not host large patches of coupling, and this has been appreciated in recent magnetotelluric studies, which show that regions of low resistivity map to regions of coupling along megathrust, and topography of the downgoing plate. So structures and roughness of what's being subducted actually can lead to fluids percolating into downgoing sediments. So we're getting ahead. So the Aleutian Megathrust, a primary feature of it is this decay and coupling as you move from east to west. The plate interface outboard of Kodiak and around Chirikov Island is fully coupled at shallow depths, or at least in this model of Lee and Freimuller 2018, and it transitions to essentially fully creeping behavior east or westward of the Shubigin Islands, which are located right around here. We observed this in the surface displacement data, so these are all trench normal velocities of sites along the Alaska Peninsula and in neighboring islands. We note that once these are corrected for far field block rotation, that sites out here have much higher trench normal velocities out here. And so describing this trend, or the way in which we describe this trend, is using an interseismic coupling model, such as this one here, which comes from Lee and Freimuller 2018. These warmer colors depict a more highly coupled subduction interface, and cool colors represent creeping behavior, where more or less the downgoing plate is sliding freely past the overriding plate. The physical model, or the physical mechanism that is used to describe this behavior, is this orientation of remnant rift structures within downgoing Pacific plate. This is at one point in time a triple junction between the Kula plate, which is almost entirely subducted beneath the Aleutians and mainland Alaska over here, and this orientation of abyssal hills and remnant rift structures from seafloor spreading, and its orientation to the subduction or the trench essentially orients how bending stresses are translated into the downgoing crust, and provides a conduit for fluids to infiltrate into the incoming sediment layer. So this orientation of rift structures, which are usually normal to the spreading direction, allows for more efficient transfer of fluids into the downgoing sediment package, which leads to generally lower coupling out in this region. Whereas over here, we can note that these are relic structures of the Farallon plate, which is more or less like ceased to exist and has been amalgamated into the Pacific plate. But this orientation is a less efficient pathway for fluids to percolate into the downgoing slab and kind of drives the large scale features of coupling behavior along this region of the megathrust. So the work actually started with observing campaign data from, so we had we had a set of 5 sites located on Mount Simeonof, which is right here in the central Aleutian Arc, or central Alaska Peninsula, sorry. This data had been excluded from previous solutions for geodetic coupling. So what we did was we tinkered with the coupling model, and the residual velocities fit to sites on the volcano are shown by these black vectors here. So once we subtracted out the predictions of a coupling model, we found this radial outward displacement. It's relatively small. It's about 1 to 2 millimeters per year velocity average, but essentially we were able to fit a fairly rudimentary Mogi source model here to explain that variation. And once we removed that feature, we found that the trench normal orientation of velocities at sites on Simeonof, so these 5 sites here would map to right here. And if we bin along profile lengths, we can actually see that they're somewhat intermediate of sites both located to the east and west. So this motivated us to kind of think about this region as being somewhat intermediate of those two. And if we were to go back to this figure, we note that the coupling characteristics ought to be relatively similar in that region. So we tinkered with that coupling model and we came up with one that was slightly better and led to lower levels of misfit, both in the Shumigan Islands and along the Alaska Peninsula. This figure is just kind of a zoom in of the Shumigan Islands right here. And this is in a sandpoint relative frame. So what we did was we took the velocity of the continuous GPS site located at Sandpoint and subtracted that out from all of the sites in the Shumigan Islands. And we noted that there was a distinct trend of higher coupling in the westward islands as opposed to the eastward islands. And this line is just orienting ourselves with this model. So this boundary between this region of slightly higher partial coupling and lower partial coupling is denoted here. So this was the physical model, which is all well and good. And so the Shumigan Islands have been a well documented seismic gap, or at least in a lot of prevailing literature. This is really kind of first pointed out by Davies et al. 1981, which noted relative absence of great earthquakes from the historic record. The Shumigan Gap is located right here, and this is just kind of a step through time, essentially, for all great ruptures that occurred along the megathrust or in this region. And it was noted that no real large earthquakes had ruptured in the Shumigans, or at least to any large extent, over the past little while. Estabrook and Boyd in 1992 reanalyzed some old seismic record sections and essentially found that the Shumigan Islands had ruptured underneath at least the western Shumigans, and there was some westward directivity, which they noted with the thrust mechanism here. There was higher amplitude arrivals at global networks to the west, I believe in Japan. Just using that one station, they estimated a 7.9, whereas stations over the east said that the event was probably closer to like a 7.1. So they determined out and they estimated that a roughly moment magnitude 7.5 would describe that event. And this was the last time essentially that the Shumigans ruptured in a large earthquake before the summer. So back in July, I believe it was July 22nd, a thrust event, so the initial hypocenter of the event was located right around here, which is actually fairly coincident with these segments and locking from GPS displacements. The rupture initiated here, and the GCMT focal mechanism was located about 50, 60 kilometers to the west of the initial hypocenter, and it is a thrust mechanism beneath the western Shumigans. We also noted westward directivity to the rupture. This is 10 days of aftershocks plotted over the coupling model, which was shown previously here, and we had a cutoff magnitude of 4 to make it into this figure. So we noted a westward directivity. A variety of other observations were made about the rupture as well. This interferogram comes from Logan Fuso and Romney Grapentin at University of Alaska. Noticed a fairly high amplitude displacements in the western Shumigans as well. This site AC12, it had a large uplift signal, which was observed, and these are co-seismic, post-seismic offsets which were determined by Jeff Reimuller. So a variety of rupture models have been advanced essentially to explain the source properties of rupture. So USGS finite fault model, which is solved primarily which is solved only from teleseismic and regional waveforms, had a super high peak of slip located right around the hypocenter and fairly large slip up dip close to the trench. There's a decent amount of slip beneath the western Schumagins and moving eastward, but this is an incredibly high amplitude, about 4 meters of slip out by the hypocenter. This model, coming from Crowell and Melgar, which was published in 2020, was solved for only using strong motion and high rate GPS. And it placed the majority of slip, or at least the highest amplitude of slip, beneath the western Schumagins. So there's a clear discrepancy between these models. The geodetic data seems to favor slip occurring underneath the western Schumagins, and there's essentially no real sampling of data out here, or at least of slip along the interface out here. The GPS data is not quite sensitive to that. A model that reconciles these two is Liu et al. 2020, which is solved for using regional teleseismic waveforms and static GPS. So they placed a high amount of stress, or a high amount of slip, or a relatively higher amount of slip out by the trench and over by the hypocenter out here, with a high peak over by the Schumagin Islands. It's fairly hard to orient with this figure, but these are the western Schumagins out here. And so a high amplitude of slip beneath the western Schumagins. And this is aftershock patterns. They also noted some swarms of very low frequency earthquakes occurring way down dip of rupture. These red dots show those swarms there. And so this comes from a colleague, Zhouhui Zhao, who's this is unpublished work. It's in preparation, but this models in conjunction static GPS, teleseismic waveforms, INSAR, and high rate GPS. And it places this high amplitude of slip beneath the western Schumagins, which is favored by all the geodetic data and those observations. But the teleseismic waveforms tell a story of at least high slip out here, and it can't be constrained with geodetic data because GPS data is relatively insensitive. So any high amplitude is kind of just, it's almost dumped out there. It can be thought of a dumping ground for excess magnitude that doesn't fit into the data. So what I did here is I plotted 5 months of the aftershock sequence on top of the coupling model. And so an interesting effect of the 7.8 event was this fairly non-double couple interplate strike slip, mostly strike slip event that occurred within the downgoing slab. There's a magnitude 7.6 and associated cluster and swarm of earthquakes. We had 2 fairly linear trends extending to the west over the course of several months. And rupture seemed to mostly be confined to these partially coupled segments 3 and 4 denoted here. When we compare the aftershock sequences with the slip models, or at least the one that synthesizes the most amount of diverse data, we can see that aftershocks do not essentially map perfectly to slip. In fact, slip was mostly confined to the Schumagin Islands out here, whereas aftershocks extended significantly westward into the creeping segment of the megathrust there. So it would be a problematic assumption to say that the rupture patch could be outlined entirely by aftershocks. It's actually the rupture patch is constrained by geodetic data, is more favorable to a model that looks something like that. So if we take that assumption, and this is work that's in review right now, it's just been submitted by Jeff Reimuller, essentially taking another look at the 1938 rupture sequence. So this orange line out here shows the initial, or at least what's been reported by Estabrook as the 1938 rupture patch. And this model, this is the model of Crowell and Melgar, which I showed a few slides back. This is the 1 meter slip contour showing a slight overlap between the two, and that the rupture from the 2020 event actually somewhat ruptured the 1938 patch. This patch was drawn essentially around aftershock locations from that event, and there was large uncertainty in those on the order of tens to almost even 100 kilometers for some of those events, because these are historic seismic records that have been processed. So what they did was essentially they reanalyzed tide gauge data and ran some forward models for tsunami wave propagation. And these solid red lines show slip contours for a more favorable model that fits the tide gauge data located in Simeonof. These are all tide gauges, which were fit to the tsunami data. So the 2.5 meter slip contour is located right here, and then the 1 meter slip contour is right here. So a model that's more favorable for the 1938 rupture actually places the majority of rupture within this highly coupled segment, which one, makes more physical sense, and two, means that this summer's event did not rupture at all any portion of the 1938 rupture sequence. So in conclusion, the July 2020 Simeonof earthquake ruptured portion of the subduction interface, which has been previously partially coupled since 1917. There are inconsistencies between slip models, particularly in the region eastward and updip of the rupture, which can't be resolved by GPS and INSAR, but the regional and teleseismic waveforms tend to place a good amount of slip there. Moment deficit rate calculations from a coupling model estimate that the plate interface beneath and outboard of the Shumagins has accumulated an equivalent moment magnitude of about 8.3 over a 100-year interval. This implies that about 45% of the accumulated seismic moment was released in the event, and that rupture did not likely extend to the 1938 zone. So thanks everyone for your attention. And again, would like to acknowledge collaborators and colleagues, and I'll leave you with this nice picture of the Kodiak shoreline. If you zoom in, you might be able to see some whales. There are some belugas off the shore at this point in time. So thanks everybody.
So we'll start with a question for Connor from Thornley. So for the locking models along the 1938 and Shumagon regions, your models put peak locking near the trench. I don't see how the landward GPS can resolve that coupling. If you seek a minimal coupling extent model, do you really need strong near trench locking?
Yeah, that's a good question. And you're right that the landward GPS cannot resolve that the trench is fully locked. This is an assumption we made when we were inverting the data, that the locking would decrease down depth and we would not get these like sinusoidal patterns where we have these large amplitude disparities at depth. What we were mainly after is modeling the along strike variations in locking, not necessarily resolving the exact locations of asperities. So we found that this modeling did a fairly good job of capturing that feature, while certainly we understand that there may be some more intricacies to the locking distribution than what we're able to show with this model. Yeah, just the data resolution that we have right now is not enough to constrain any type of other feature besides broad along strike variations.
All right, cool. So another question from Connor from Donna Shillington. Very nice talk, Connor. What are the most significant changes between your updated coupling model and the model of Lee and Freimuller 19?
So thanks, Donna. The main feature is this insertion of a clear segment boundary within the Shumagon Islands, particularly denoting that the Western Shumagins and the Eastern Shumagins are on slightly different, or they're sampling slightly different patches of the megathrust, and they're kind of sampling edge effects of either. We also found, as a side note, that the amount of accumulated moment deficit is explained a whole lot better by the event if we have this discrete patch right here. That explains the amount of accumulated energy a whole lot better than the Lee model. Essentially, if we integrated over time the moment deficit rate from the Lee model, it would have almost fully ruptured all accumulated moment for an entire 100-year period this past summer. So we found that this model did a better job of explaining the earthquake and fitting the GPS data. Those are the main features, yeah.
Okay, thanks. We have a question from Roland Bergman. Great talk, Connor. Do you have any new insight in the coupling/slip behavior to the west of the 2020 rupture? It shows us completely uncoupled in the interseismic models, but Lopez and Okal find the 1946 event to be an 8.6, so plenty of coupling is needed. Mm-hmm. Is there a way to reconcile this?
Yeah, that's a good question. So the 1946 event actually ruptured slightly into the Shumagen segment. I think that a splay fault was imaged. I think Anne Vassell had done work that imaged that. Yeah, clearly there is some type of slip deficit that needs to be accounted for in there. Let me pull up a figure of our geodetic station coverage tends to, it kind of terminates towards the, let me share my screen again.
For sure.
So yeah, there we go. You can see that. So our station coverage peters out at this tip of the Alaska Peninsula.
Do you want to make sure your screen's shared? There we go.
There we go. Yeah. So station coverage peters out over here. So there could very well be some locking in here that's completely just not sampled by the data set that was used in the study. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Some propagation westward or eastward, sorry, from great earthquakes in this region has been noted.
Yeah. Cool. All right. So the fourth question for Connor. Good talk, Connor. So the 2020 7.8 event occurred inside a region of 40 to 50% coupling along the subduction interface, then implying perhaps a nearly 100% coupling ratio for that region. And what is the depth to the subduction in this part of the arc? Thanks. So 2 questions.
So I believe that the depth to the slab interface out by the outer Shumagins is probably close to 25, is about 25 kilometers, maybe, something like that. So the first question was asking about the amount of locking.
Yeah, I think maybe what the fact that you have an earthquake might occur for, or imply for the amount of. Can you still get a 7.8 with only partial locking?
Yeah. So again, the partial locking is imaging a long strike property of the subduction zone, and it's generally within a broad area. So, physical models tend to place smaller asperities in there, but we cannot resolve any type of smaller asperity using this approach. So it could very well be that there is a little patch of higher coupling in there that we just can't resolve, and just averaged over that long strike width, we get a coupling ratio of about 50%, I think is probably the correct way of responding to that.
Okay, cool. If there are no more questions right now, if anybody watching or anybody that watches the recording of this, because we'll post it on YouTube, has questions for Connor and Shui-Ming, feel free to contact them or catch them at a future meeting. Otherwise, I think we'll wrap up. So thanks so much, Connor and Shui-Ming, for taking this on and for 2 great presentations. Thanks everyone for attending and taking the time, and stay safe, everyone. Hope to see you all again soon.